Okay, so welcome everyone. Thank you for taking some time in your lunch to come and meet with Jeannie and I today. My name is Amanda. I am with HRx Services, and Jeannie Vallier is my business partner, and we are excited to be sharing information around the Equal Pay for Equal Work Act and the Healthy Family Workplaces Act. So we definitely want to make sure we get through all of our content today. If you haven't joined us before, our sessions usually tend to be pretty conversational, which I think is fun. It's fun for Jeannie and I. So this will be not your standard webinar, so to speak. But we do hope to get through that content. And so I just want to share a few housekeeping and introductory remarks here before we get started. First, HRx Services, we are a consulting company. We focus on human resources, and really we're a boutique level service-based company. What that means is that we partner with our client partners and their HR teams to help them be able to execute HR with excellence. We are not an outsourcing company or a payroll company. That's not really our jam. More what we do is just really help them support whatever needs they have, because we all know HR is a tough profession, certainly. So new legislation coming up this year, and some things that have been enacted this year in 2020 just because of COVID has certainly been something interesting for us to navigate. And so we're happy to be able to share some of our thoughts with you today. Couple of things as we get started. First, the session is being recorded. So if you are not interested in participating in a recorded session, we would ask that you exit at this time. But otherwise, you are free to connect with us in the chat and Q&A, because we are using the webinar function in the Zoom tool. And so there is no video capabilities or anything like that. So if you have any questions, please address them there. Additionally, we always like to give our disclaimer here that we are not attorneys or tax professionals, and we would encourage you to always seek advice from those partners that you use in those areas specifically for those types of pieces of advice and information that you need for your organizations. Certainly what we're providing here is more best practice and the things that we've seen that's really available to most everyone, but not from that tax or attorney standpoint. So that being said, let's go ahead and get moving forward. So everything is working. We should move to our next slide. So equal pay for equal work. Let's see.
Not yet.
There we go. Equal Pay for Equal Work Act. Really the goal of this act and what we're going to be focusing on is to avoid pay discrimination based on sex for substantially similar work, and instead have it be measured by skill, effort, and responsibility. And so today that's going to be our focus for how we're going to walk through this session. One thing to know is that on the phone today, we've got myself, Amanda Erickson, and then Jeannie Vallier. Again, we own HRx Services and are partners in that HR consulting company, although we've grown pretty substantially over the last year or so. So we're excited to have some other team members that are supporting our efforts, but this is who is on the phone for today. Jeannie, do you want to say hello really quickly?
Good morning, everyone. I'm excited. We just did this, so I'm excited to continue to have a discussion about this.
It's going to be fun.
Right.
Okay. So let's talk a little bit about how we got here. So one of the things that I like to share with people, especially when we're talking with clients or working with other entities who have questions, why this act, why this particular piece of legislation? And so I like to take just a quick moment and share a little bit about how the construct of it works. First and foremost, really we're looking at the legislative process in general. So we've got our legislators, and when we're talking on a national level or for federal, we have more of that career politician, right? The person who's been a senator for your state for 3 decades, something in that space. And part of that, is good. There can be good pieces to that where really they're very involved in how this works, how a bill becomes a law. I know there's like a song and a cartoon about it or something like that. Jeannie, I know you know what I'm talking about. I personally have never seen this, but I just hear about it a lot. But what's nice about from the federal level is that really they do practice that, like that is part of what they understand. And because that is really their sole position anymore, you kind of have that political career politician. However, in the state, we do have term limits and things in that nature as far as how our legislative branch or the representatives and senators work in our state. So one thing to remember is that first, it always becomes, they create these bills, they go through the House and the Senate, it's signed off by the governor, and then it becomes legislation. A couple of things to note is that your legislators, which is really kind of cool, can be your neighbors. They can be attorneys, bankers, real estate agents, sometimes HR professionals, but I think we only have one, the last I knew, in our state legislators. So when you're thinking about it, kind of understand that really, if I was asked to put in some information around an HR bill or a bill that might affect employment, that might be an area of comfort for me. But if I was a legislator in our Colorado state government and you were asking me to build legislation on roads or infrastructure, not a very common place for me to be spending my time. So I might have some limits in how I understand that process. So just to kind of keep in mind that we got here because we've got folks who may not necessarily understand how to apply what we're talking about when it comes to employment law. So there might be some holes, in other words. So the Equal Pay Act, Jeannie, I know that we've talked about this. The Equal Pay Act, we have a federal law. So sometimes people say, why do we have a state law? What are your thoughts on that, Jeannie? I know when we talked about this earlier, you had some good insights there.
So some on this call may or may not know, but in 1964, the federal government determined and they enacted the Equal Pay Act, which was supposed to accomplish pay equity based on sex. Well, we're 56 years into it, and I'm pretty sure it's an easy statement to make that if I'm only making 81 cents on the dollar to my male counterpart, we have not accomplished what they intended 56 years ago. So I think more and more states are getting diligent. They're just trying to close that gap. They're trying to make effective legislation that will truly make a difference and make that happen quickly and expediently and appropriately. And I guess, a lot of people can debate the merits of whether, Colorado or any other state accomplished that. But at the end of the day, they're taking action into their own hands and they're doing it, as opposed to what could not have successfully been accomplished under the Equal Pay Act.
Absolutely. Thank you. And I think you're right. And that's when we start to talk about, the compliance piece. Well, if we already had something, why isn't it working? And so we're really talking when we're speaking to the Colorado specifically, there's a lot of compliance components to it and a lot of different penalties for not adhering to the compliance standards. And at least in Colorado, the CDLE, the Colorado Department of Labor and Employment, is going to be our resounding area of where we're really holding this compliance is going to be directed by that agency. That said, sometimes what happens when we have acts or new legislation that is enacted, there are some holes or some things that may not be totally clear and have clarity on how we move forward. And so we have, the act being created, we have the compliance piece behind it, but where we actually see, and what I put here is like proof is in the pudding, is when it goes to litigation. When we have someone who says, I don't feel like this has happened the way that I thought it should be happening or the way that I've read or whatever, and they sue an employer, they do something in that space, then we have what we call that case law, which is really where we can dive in and say, okay, now in practice, how does this actually work? So that really brings in kind of the full fold of how we have our executive, judiciary, and legislative branches working together. So just something to kind of think about and why we got to where we got to. So let's talk a little bit about the requirements. So Jeannie, I'm going to speak to the first one, and then I'm going to ask you to kind of talk a little bit about the next one. So the first is going to be, we can't seek pay history or prohibit wage rate discussion in our workplaces any longer. Now, I know Jeannie has talked about that before, that we do kind of have some laws that already really protect that ability. Might be more for specifically to the hourly or non-exempt folks, but when we're talking now all positions, all areas, is that we cannot ask any longer what someone made in their previous position. So this would, really drive down to how your job applications are asking questions, to what your managers or your hiring managers or hiring team members may be asking in interviews, those types of things that no longer can be a part of that discussion. And then certainly one of the ways to make sure that equal pay is happening is having discussions and conversation in the workplace with your coworkers to say, you're making more money than I am. Why is that? And so I think that that's one of those first key pieces. Jeannie, do you want to talk a little bit about the communication with jobs and promotions?
I want to add something to something you just said. You said employees do this so they want to know, why is that? Why are you making more than me? That is, I'm sure, definitely happening. I don't think that's the only intent or desire or outcome. It's not necessarily why, but to create that level of transparency for organizations. Because I think that's where businesses struggle. They think that, some things should be so secret and so held. And you know what? I'm guilty of that myself. You know that as being my partner. But in terms of compensation, it is what it is. I mean, why wouldn't you want to share that? Because if someone's making $2 less, I'm hoping that managers or businesses have a good reason, which is maybe they have less experience. Maybe they have one of those, overarching 6 differentiating reasons as to why it should be less. Because if there is no reason, then you know what? That's where the equity is going to come into play, is because they do talk about it.
Absolutely.
So communicating the jobs internally with pay. So this is kind of fun, because I think a lot of employers are saying, well, I don't want to do this. I don't want everybody to know this information. And I challenge them to say, well, how did you post positions previously? Well, I put it on Indeed. Well, you're not changing your business practice. You're just adding to it. And then for, those folks that struggle with, well, wait a minute, I'm of the notion that I believe in high potential employees. And if I identify this employee who is a rock star and I know in 6 months I'm going to promote them, I don't want to have to promote. I don't want to have to put a posting. Well, there is a slight change. Now you're going to have to do it. But you know what? I challenge you to say, you know what? You may have missed another rock star and didn't feel, as comfortable to express that they have those same desires and intentions that maybe someone who's a little more ambitious did. So the only thing this is doing is just formalizing, I think, things you already do and setting some more clarifying expectations. So all positions have to be posted with a pay rate, i.e. if it's an hourly position and it has a flat dollar amount or a salary or a range. And that range, to answer anybody's question, it is not from $12 to $100. It has to be reasonable to legitimately what is the salary range that you've defined internally, because let's be honest, that's part of what this law is saying. You better get your house in order and make sure that you have compensation data to support the business decisions going forward.
I think you always do a good job with sharing about that, in particular with making sure that, you have some intentionality behind it. It's now, like, to your point, people might be doing this already on some level. All we're doing is documenting what that process looks like. And I think that one of the things that I always try to share about with folks is that oftentimes when new laws come into play, I mean, just speaking honestly here, we see it really translate maybe a couple of years later, that it really kind of trickles down. It takes time. There's so much information out there. What I find, going to be challenging with this particular law is that the minute you post on Indeed without a job, like a range or a pay rate there, that's going to be low hanging fruit for people who are looking for people not in compliance. You're, in a sense, outing yourself without intending to. And I think that for me is where it's that low-hanging fruit piece, is why this is so important and what we're trying to talk through today. Now, Jeannie, I know we talked a little bit about, the tracking wage history and keeping that for up to 2 years after termination. We've had that conversation that this is very non-different from some of our other, pay records and payroll record keeping requirements and the things that already exist. I think the difference here is that they're also saying you need to have your job descriptions attached to that position. And so if you have that person, and that I think is new, I don't know if everybody really does have job positions or job descriptions included in their kind of employee files or record keeping processes. So it's not just now I have all the job descriptions in one file. It's now, okay, now which employee translates to that job description needs to really be kept together.
And I would argue in regards to that, I think a lot of employers don't even have job descriptions, period. So this may be an added additional step, is first creating the job description, then keeping track of it and all the versions thereafter once it's modified. I think that's why a good best practice is, when you have a job description for an employee, having them sign off on it, not only for them to understand the expectations that they're being held accountable to, but now it gets assigned to their employee file and it's forever a record. And then you don't have to worry about those record retention issues.
I agree.
Because you're already keeping that information based on payroll and other laws for the set period of time.
Absolutely. And ensuring pay equity, as we walk through the rest of this, we're going to talk a lot more about that. So those are just going to be some things to note as we go along. So when we're talking about the liabilities, then oftentimes, we're always making that business case. Well, what is the liability? What if I don't want to do this? What if I'm not concerned with it? What does that look like? And so when you're looking at this particular page and this slide here, what we're talking about is the requirements are not seeking pay history, not prohibiting wage discussion, and then ensuring that you have pay equity in your organization. If you do not do those things, the liabilities that could result would include things like economic damages, which could have been the difference of what should have been paid. And if somebody is found to say, yeah, you were paid less than you should have been, that can be, I think, up to the 3 years. And then liquidated damages, as well as legal and equitable relief, which to me kind of talks about, legal fees, things in that space. And then reasonable cost, question mark, question mark, question mark. This is one of those holes. We're not really sure exactly what reasonable costs might mean. Is it training? Is it who knows? But when it comes down to it, the thing that I really try to look at when I'm talking about this is that if you don't do something and you knew you should have, so it's kind of that good faith effort. One of the things that we've seen is that, when that can't be established, your liquidated damages could also be, part of what you would have to be paying out. So let's say, for example, you found your economic damages are $30,000. Your liquidated damages in employment law equal that same amount. So now your penalty is instead a $30,000 change. You're now talking about 60. So I think that's why it's important to kind of understand, familiarize yourself, and be giving at least that good faith effort. So if anything were to happen, it would be less harmful to the organization. The next slide, I'm going to ask you, Jeannie, if you can just kind of share a little bit about it. Again, our violations are going to be in green, like these are the requirements. We have to communicate all jobs internally, post jobs with pay rates, the job descriptions for every employee, and then tracking that wage history. If we don't, Jeannie, can you share a little bit about what the penalties or liability could be on the employer for not being in compliance there?
And what should be noted that's interesting about these penalties, they're being assessed outside of the CDLE. They've appointed a separate, entity or a division that's going to manage the compliance piece of this. And they're going to have one person who's kind of head of this, who's leading that charge and kind of, in some ways, the sole decider. There's not going to be, unlike the Department of Labor, the EEOC, where there's a lot of case law and a lot of other determining factors, or moreover than that this fine equals this amount of money. It's just, they have a range from 500 to 10,000. So if, they determined today, they felt that was more egregious than yesterday, you may see a higher amount. And the other interesting thing is they can go straight to court. There is no having the buffer of the government to kind of, oh, wait a minute, we need to give you a right to sue letter. So if you have a position, for example, the same thing we said, if you have someone you're going to promote, you knew it was a rock star and you went ahead and did it anyway, and now you have someone else that heard of said promotion and they're upset. They didn't have that opportunity to apply for it. So just one moment, one position, it can range from 500 to 10,000. And can I be honest? I think that if you, the employer, get hit with this fine, they're not just going to stop there. They're going to say, well, now we want to see your payroll records, or maybe now we want this. So you now have exposed your house to make sure everything is in order. And same thing without the pay rate or failing to. And again, can I just say some of these other things are not new. I mean, the federal government already, or the Fed laws already require these. You know, failure to retain your records, your payroll records, you have to retain for 4 years. Your applicant records, you have to retain for this amount of time. So you should already be doing these things. Now the state is just monetizing that fine should you not, and you're kept or you're held accountable. And I think, you know, Amanda, you're right. We won't know this is tested until it actually starts happening. And it may take a little bit of time, but not as much as I think you think. Because when Ban the Box went into play in September, I actually went out and looked at how many filings there were, and there were hundreds of violations, because that's easy. To your point, it's low-hanging fruit. They can see your job application online, and there you're asking, were you a previous convicted felon? And so now they're like, done. You asked something you shouldn't have, and now we're coming after you. So I think the same thing will be with this. I mean, it'll be pretty easy.
Absolutely. I think so as well. And I think that's the piece, is that there's just so many public ways that we're talking about some of this information that they're now really, you know, legislating needs to be more transparent, to your point, Jeannie. That I don't know if we were as comfortable, or at least it wasn't standard practice all the time. DOE, determined on experience, is a common phrase when it comes to the compensation piece of something. And so I think that's why just having that education around it is going to be really important, something you can take to your leadership team as well. So what does this mean to me, right? Like, that's the business case. Well, why does this mean, what does this mean to me? Our goal, and the reason that we're doing as many sessions on this as we can and really trying to spread the word, is that we don't want you to be the one that's litigated and becomes the story for how we do this going forward. So I think the most important thing is, you know, understand where that low-hanging fruit is, really focus on that. If you've got high positions that have a lot of turnover and you're posting all the time, maybe start there, you know, something in that space where, you know, there's more potential for risk. If you're looking at it and trying to say, holy cow, it's, you know, September and this is 2 months away, what do we have to do? There's a lot of work to be done. Start with those things that you know buys you the most risk, would be my way I would start, at least to start. So let's talk a little bit about the different components of it and why we think it really comes into the aspect here. Hiring, I'm going to talk about that. Jeannie, I'm going to have you just kind of share a little bit about maybe good processes around it. I think we've talked a lot about promotions and record keeping. So when we get to the compensation grade in particular. For hiring, the reason that I think this is going to be substantial is that my background had been heavily engaged in talent acquisition, recruiting, those types of areas. And I've sat on a lot of interviews, and I've seen a lot of hiring managers say a lot of things they should not. And never with malice. I wanted to honestly say that. I don't think that people intend to, I don't think it's people's intention to say, I want to pay her less because she's a woman. You know, I don't see that. People don't say that to me, but they inevitably step in it and get themselves into a place where that could be argued. And I think that that's the piece that we want to look at. So when we're talking about this, it's not just, okay, what are our hiring practices and how do we send out our job positions to the world? I think there's also this component of hiring and how you're going to work through that process. I think a lot of people hired people based on discretionary things like what they made before, what the market was doing at that moment in time, whether or not somebody was a better negotiator. I mean, I think that we've seen that happen, and I think that going forward, there needs to be a little more standardization and internal processes being done so that when we are hiring someone, our practices are going to be in alignment with what Colorado is asking for. Jeannie, do you want to talk a little to just compensation, grade, qualifications, maybe talk briefly about broadbanding and those types of things? We have more in later on, but I just wanted to give an outline there.
You know, I think just if we're going to go into it in more detail, probably not so much, but I mean, I think it's kind of important, especially if you have, I think the best example is if you have customer service reps, or if you have multiple of a same type of either job family or job title, and a family might be, maybe it's accounts receivable, accounts payable, accounting clerk, they all have a like or similar, so they're in the same family. I would always encourage a broad band. Maybe an AP person starts at 17, and maybe an AR starts at 1750, and maybe an accounting clerk starts at 1675. The broadband would start at 1675 and go up to the highest level of whatever one of the three of those are. And then that way you can lump them all in there, and you're not trying to manage a whole bunch of salary ranges. That can be very cumbersome.
It can, especially if you're looking at position by position. And if you don't have any kind of tool to really help you understand what that data point looks like with years of experience and things in that nature, that can be very, very challenging. We know from the BLS in particular that HR, for example, there are 14,000 people practicing the profession of HR in Colorado, and all 14,000 of them are grouped into 3 areas. And that would be like managers, specialists, and then your admin team. And I look at that and I think, gosh, managers could really run the range from an HR manager making $75,000, $80,000 up to your VP or CHROs who are making, well into 6 figures. And so I think that those are the things that we really have to understand. The BLS might be really exaggerated, especially if you're looking at like, I need a director. What does that mean? So just also recognize the sources of where you're grabbing that information is going to be important. So let's dive into this. So this is our process. Jeannie and our team, she is really our technical executor when it comes to these types of areas. And so for me, Jeannie, maybe you can just kind of walk through how this is our process just quickly and kind of share what our overview is. Certainly doesn't have to be your process, but just trying to share the level of involvement that we think really it takes to get this in alignment.
Absolutely. So the compensation strategy is just that. We sit down with one of our clients and we do what's called a statement of work. We indicate everything that we are going to provide them. But the first step is determining what is their compensation strategy. Some companies financially, they can only be at what the market is paying. So for example, if that's minimum wage, then that's where they'll be is at the market for that particular job. Others perhaps need to lag the market. They can't justify financially to meet the market demands. And in fact, maybe their design is culturally, they're going to provide more in benefits, or maybe in time off, or maybe they're going to let them bring their dogs to work, or who knows, whatever it is. And by the way, that's a thing. That is a real thing. But generally, another philosophy would be to lead the market. Maybe they want to always be the most in-class premier employer, and they define that specifically as their compensation strategy. So once we determine that, we formalize that. We actually put it in writing, because we encourage our employers that we work with that once they've defined what that strategy is, and that's the one that they're going to set their salary ranges to and design their policies and procedures, share it out with the company. let employees know this is our intent at this moment in time. That can change, life change, COVID happens. So, but at this moment in time, this is our defined strategy. From there, we start working with them to either determine if they don't have job descriptions in place, that we conduct job analysis by giving them what we call position description questionnaires, and let the folks that are doing the jobs, the supervisors, kind of work through what does that look like to build those job descriptions. Perhaps they already have job descriptions in place, and now we're reviewing them not only for are they accurate and up to date, but are they really relevant? I mean, a job description shouldn't list every single job duty that an employee has. It's the essential duties and functions of that job. So if they left and you had to post that position, what are the critical responsibilities that a new employee would need to be able to have skills to do? And then the next thing is, grouping job descriptions. And I think this is really important. A lot of people say, I think this is a missing step, because really the vast majority of compensation is based on external factors, i.e. market data, i.e. the market itself, what will it bear? But the notion of ranking, whether you use a ranking or a point method, by grouping some job descriptions, and I love Amanda's. I thought it was cute the first time she used it until we actually ran into this situation. But if you want to hire a director of first impressions, there's two reasons you're hiring that position, because you value that first point of contact in your organization to be profound. But in the real world, us HR people, that's the receptionist. But you've got to, in this particular made up company, they think that is maybe, if not more important than the CEO, because without this role, they don't think that they would be where they are. So they value it critically high. And if when they go to do their comp data or their market research, if they have it valued up here, but the market has it valued much lower, that's a problem. They're not seeing the value of how they value something internally versus externally. And that's why you want to go through that exercise to either assign a point, and maybe it's out of 100 or out of 10, however you do it, or you rank them in level of importance. And then when you go to pull that market data, they should be in alignment. And if they are not, something is wrong. Either you've overvalued it, or perhaps maybe the market's undervalued it, and you will pay above whatever your salary market data you get. And then you start the external review, which is that market data you're pulling. And when I say you, I mean us, as in from HRx, we pull it from a paid compensation database. And let's be honest, it's not cheap. It's a significant investment. But on the inverse, if you don't have access to that type of information, you're going to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, you're going to Google. Everybody loves Google. You're going to Indeed. You're going to, if you're a member of the Society of Human Resource Management, you're going there. But all these places that you're going to, there's a couple things you need to keep in mind. A, compensation data as a whole, no matter where you attain it, it's always dated. Because to get that moment in time, this is what a group of people make, that's virtually impossible unless you have an HRIS system that taps into multiple employers. And so it's that point in time data. So in other words, most market data is anywhere from 6 months to a year, maybe even older, if it's the Bureau of Labor Statistics. So then you have to age your data to bring it current. So then you have now good market data. So now you evaluate your internal and your market or your external information, you bring it together, and now you got to start dividing or creating job grades and salary ranges. And those are two different things. I think a lot of people who say, I have job grades. No, job grades is maybe similar to how the federal government, they have GS 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, step 1, 2, 3, 4. As opposed to a salary range is based on a job title, or perhaps even you broadbanded it. It's starting from a percentile to a percentile with a designated midpoint. And with a salary range, you can determine what's called a compa ratio, that you are paying them at midpoint or greater, or at midpoint and below. based on whatever that salary range is. And then the last part, and this is where I will give all the accolades to my amazing partner, it's standard deviation. You know what? That's a statistical format. And if anybody knows me, and there's one person on this call other than you that knows me, I don't like math. I did not do well. I didn't sign up for math. I'm an HR person. However, it is a critical factor, even with HR professionals. So much so the EEOC has pretty much defined what that standard deviation is based on compliance from an affirmative action standpoint. While general compensation is not to adhere to that, if you already have a baseline, you might as well stick with what is pretty much tried and true, and that's a standard deviation of 2 or more. So what does that mean for us non-math people? So if I have $100 or $200, everybody who falls in that range between 100 and 200, as long as I don't have a deviation of 2 points or 2 factors or $2, however you're doing it, or more in between the low to the high, then I'm fine. But if I do, then you have a problem. And the problem typically can be handled either adjusting compensation, increasing your range. I don't suggest that one. Perhaps maybe you have a position misclassified and maybe they're doing X and they should be doing B. But definitely you need to go through that process. And again, Amanda made this crazy convoluted spreadsheet that does all of that for us. Thank God. It's not a simple just plop in. So if you don't have that, definitely spend some time in Excel. And I think the final piece is once you've figured that standard deviation, that just tells you compensation. Now you've not reviewed any other factors, i.e. The 2 laws at hand, equal pay or even EEO, equal employment opportunity, or comps. Or equal pay. I mean, all of those things now need to be variables. You know, is your males all making more than your females based on, you know, any of the differentiating experiences, education, things like that? Are your minorities or are your females making more or less? By the way, sex is not specific to just us females. I feel like a lot of people thought when this law came out, it was female based. That is not the case. And in fact, we have a client where we just saw that when they paid all their females more than they did their one token male. And I was like, oh, you're going to have to do something with it. Oh, no, that's not how that law works. No, it is. It is based on sex. It doesn't matter which one you are. It's just, it has to be equitable between the sexes.
Absolutely. Again, the goal is to avoid discrimination for substantially similar work. So we're trying to provide those intentions to make it intentional based on the job, not like the position, not the person specifically. And so one of the things that we've talked about, and I'm just going to touch on a few things first, the director of first impressions, this is obviously, we're not doing a culture webinar and that's not really the focus of this, but I will argue, I get where people are coming from when they're saying we want to give this person real understanding that this position is really important to us. And I will tell you, I will argue all day long with folks and say they will do that based on how you treat them, not necessarily what you give them as their title. At the end of the day, they also know they're still a receptionist. And so I think that, and I don't want to say it like that, they're not still, but over exaggerating a title isn't going to necessarily give them value. It's how you treat them is going to give them value. And I think that that's what we really need to understand when we're kind of looking at some of these things. My only other points would be just to state that when you are looking at that market data, you are doing that external piece. What you're really looking for, and Jeannie did a great job outlining it, is not only the age component, but also where is that data coming from? So if we're going to Google, if we're going to salary.com and just pulling like regular salary data, a lot of that's going to be crowdsourced, Glassdoor, right? I can go on and say what I made all day long. What we're looking for is good data that is going to be coming from the sources that you're hoping to get it from, which is going to be HR and people like that. So I think you really need to make sure that you're understanding where that data is coming from. And so let's talk about that. Jeannie has shared a lot of this with us. So I think that when we send out these slides, this will be helpful just to kind of dive into where that is. But, you know, talking about your strategic direction, she talked about lead, match, lag, you know, what are you trying to do? And that's going to be important because as you're really identifying the direction you want to go, you should have an idea of where you're coming from, or what's important. And that is equally as important. We talk about it oftentimes that sales is important, and so is P&L. And HR is important, and so is our budget and accounting. And so we have to have that idea. And then I love when you talk about the grouping of job families and some of those things. We're just giving some ideas here. Certainly that could be different for your own organization, but just stuff to think about. So Jeannie, we've talked very, very briefly about this. I'm going to ask you if you would kind of walk us through what the yardstick of qualifications are. What is that measurement? We can't use discretion anymore. Manager discretion is out the window. External, what they may be for is out the window. What are the things then that we can use to have a differential between two employees doing similar work?
You know, in this list, I feel like it's always been there. I mean, they've just put it in more of a formal fashion, because these should have already been the notions of why you may have a difference based on pay. So seniority. So we had a client who asked, great, so if I hired someone tomorrow and I've had someone who's been here for 5 years, I can pay them $20 difference or whatever it was. It was this huge amount. I was like, well, I don't think that level of gap is going to warrant that level. You know, they were very loose in how they said seniority. So I do think that employers, especially if you had somebody who was hired on November and one that was hired maybe 9 months later, that is definitely not a large enough gap. I think seniority really, it should be more thoughtful. I always say, look at your vacation policies, how you rank your seniority there when you start to increase it, because that's a liability you take on your books, and you value that a lot, that you're going to give the people who've been here a really long time that much more. So if they're closer in time, then that was one of the benchmarks I kind of used. Merit system, you know, this is a tough one, because I think, you know, pay for performance has been a debated philosophy for quite some time. And if you're going to delineate based on merit, which is meaning, you know, how well an employee is doing their job, that you compensate them more or less, there's a lot of factors that go into that. Rater bias. So, you know, one manager may like an employee and the other one may not, and therefore that employee never really truly succeeds financially. So I caution employers on this particular one, because there's a lot of human factor in that potential of giving people increases based on a level of performance or abilities. Now, quality and quantity.
Well, and I just want to interject there, just for
go for it.
I agree with you, and this would also preclude the fact that you are doing performance reviews.
Yes.
And that you have some kind of rating system with qualifiable reasons. Like I will talk about this all day long. Like, what's the difference between a 4 and a 5? Like, you know, you have the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 metrics, right? It's like so is one a B and one is an A? Like, I'm like, I still have a hard time really understanding that. And I do this. So I think when you're talking about how your rating systems look, like, it needs to be truly understood what they're qualifying in order to use merit as a recommendation for increasing, because it's very subjective. It can. So yeah, you know, like I said, think about that. What's the difference between a 4 and a 5? And, you know, and does everybody gets 4s, gets a certain percentage? Like, what does that look like? So I think Jeannie hit the nail on the head. And I think that this is one that we see a lot. Well, they're just a rock star, so I'm giving them a raise, you know, and that's kind of where the conversation ends. We now need like data to back up why they're a rock star. So I think that that's important to think about. Okay, continue. Sorry.
And then to take it one step further, that you have the system in place that both understand it. It's not just mentally in my mind through osmosis. You will know this system, that it's clear on both sides and that it's attainable and all of that. So, but quality and quantity, I feel like that's like, I've always loved that one, because if you produce crap, you will not be rewarded. If you produce a diamond, you will be rewarded. Or if I make 100 widgets and you only made 5, that's easy. These are easy metrics, very, very, very easy. Because you have quality standards and either you met it and exceeded it or you didn't. I mean, I think those are good. Geographic area. Can I tell you, I struggle with this one a little bit. So we have a client that is based in Fort Collins and based in Longmont, and they feel that that's enough distance to warrant a huge difference in pay, meaning one be substantially higher than the other. And I would argue otherwise. And I say that with the utmost sincerity, because miles versus hours. I mean, I lived back east and I lived 11 miles where I worked, but it took me an hour and a half. I feel I should be compensated for that. And I don't think from, city threshold to city threshold, 21 miles will potentially warrant that level of that they want to create. I'm thinking more of, I live in Fort Morgan versus Vail. I think that, for a state, yeah, Denver Metro versus Loveland, or Denver Metro versus even Colorado Springs, because they have very different dynamics between the two cities, and plus, it's potentially an hour between them. But anyway, education, that's a pretty easy one. You have a high school versus associate versus bachelor's. But I also caution employers, be careful, because on that bachelor's, you don't necessarily need to make a customer service rep have a bachelor's degree. And the training, that can also be subjective. So I think, just using these metrics very carefully. Travel, I think that's also a pretty easy one. If I'm a road warrior salesperson and I'm out Monday through Friday hitting the peak, then that's easy, versus maybe I'm an inside salesperson and I never leave my desk except to travel to the restroom. I could see a differentiating compensation between those two roles. But some of these are pretty subjective and can be and have always been.
And I think all the more reason that whatever your process is going to be, have it be intentional, have it be understood. And to Jeannie's point, not only that, but as much as you're comfortable being as transparent as possible with the team, you're going to have less questions down the road and less room for making assumptions, because you're kind of laying it out there. So I think that's a key point. So the rest of the slides here really are just going to focus on some of those examples, like, what does that point factor really look like? How would I do those things, as far as how you're kind of making some of those choices. And some other areas that we've talked about. So Jeannie had talked about a compa ratio, and what does that look like if you're determining what your midpoint is, and then you're looking at how everybody is equalizing in that. You can clearly see where people are falling short or above and those types of things. And then certainly you can put in some of your other areas. Oh, well, this has more experience, education, whatever that might look like. But at least on some general level, that's something you can throw into an Excel sheet and really kind of figure out. So you don't need any fancy tools, just to see if you've got any issues. And then, when you're talking about it, what does that mean? For our company strategy, good old SWOT analysis, love those things, and kind of thinking about what that could mean for you and where you're at. So as Jeannie had shared, this is that equation for standard deviation. I mean, it's awfully simple. So I do think it is something just to kind of work through if that's something you're looking at. Again, I don't think that there is a precursor in the law itself that says, what does it mean if it's pay equity? You're supposed to establish that you have pay equity, but I don't think there's anything that, at least I've read in the law itself, that says it must be this. That standard deviation of the two that Jeannie's talking about is more from that case law, the EEO, SCOTUS rulings, things that we've seen in previous legislation that's led us to believe maybe that's a good guiding point. I think we'll determine that again as things move forward as to what cases they've said that is equitable and what they say isn't, to give us a better understanding. But for now, I think this is a good starting point. So again, we've kind of talked a little bit about our process, and Jeannie shared through at least how we do it, whether or not that's what you want to do. And then certainly with the recruitment piece, just again, talking about some of those areas with how do we train our managers? What is our process going forward? How are we using our recruiting platforms? Because I think we posted 4 and assisting one of our clients just last week. So that's 4 opportunities for $40,000 in penalties if we miss the boat. Certainly, could only be 2, but at the 2,000. But at the same point, we're trying to kind of look at it from that proactive and pragmatic point of view. So let's talk really quickly about Healthy Families Workplaces Act. So this is the other piece that we wanted to make sure we highlighted. It's new legislation. There's kind of a part A and a part B. And so trying to really understand what those differences are. Jeannie, would you mind just sharing a little bit about these different requirements, some of the things that people need to be thinking about, like today, what does it look like, and what will it look like starting January 1st?
Right. So the employee paid sick leave and the emergency family medical leave that are tied up in a bow for the Family First Coronavirus Response Act. Pretty much that was something that Congress enacted. I say tied up because it's like he threw 2 crazy laws into like a little, anyway. So both of those supposed to sunset, meaning they're supposed to go away by December 31st, 2020. I do use the word supposed to because right now both the House and the Senate are looking to ways to potentially extend some version of that. So stay tuned, that very well could change. But the interesting thing about these 2 laws is it temporarily provided paid sick leave and paid family medical leave to all employers who had employees of 500 or less. Now there was some, potential tax credits depending on when you obtained or offered this leave. If you maybe on a different note participated in the Paycheck Protection Act, but that's kind of a different nuance. But generally there was potential credit for offering this paid leave, and the requirements to which you had to offer were pretty, I don't want to say liberal, but pretty generous, I guess, in terms of what they would give and how it was administered. And the level of documentation was de minimis compared to, for example, FMLA traditionally. And it was pretty much determined this was offered because of a new word that I like to affectionately refer to as COVID. It's just a new word in our life. Anyway, now starting January 1st, Colorado has taken an action and a step. Back in August, they passed their own version of a paid sick leave applicable to the entire state of Colorado, regardless of a pandemic. So this is now, they're one of many, I think there's at least 20 states in the U.S. or in the lower 48 that offer paid sick leave in some form or fashion. And this particular paid sick leave is based on 1 hour for every 30 hours worked. I don't know if you have another slide that goes into more detail.
I think, yep, we do.
Okay. But this is applicable to employers of 16 or more versus in 2022, the entire state, regardless of size. So if you have 1 employee, it'll be applicable to just that 1 employee unless, you're a sole proprietor and then it's just yourself. I think the interesting thing is how the 2 currently work together right now. And additionally, should they extend one into 2020 or into 2021, how they will work together going forward. Meaning, will they run concurrent? And then how do they run concurrent, i.e. a mandated paid sick leave by the state versus how do you typically administer that in your own policies?
Absolutely. And I think some of the key provisions here, which we thought was interesting, is that while FFCRA was really 500 and less employees, and a lot of those employers maybe had never done FMLA before, so this was kind of a new piece. What the Healthy Family Workers Act is it broadened that to include all employers now in the state of Colorado. So if you were over 500 people after HFWA passed, now this applies to you, whereas before it maybe not. And so I think that's the key piece between now and the end of the year. Now, mainly largely pandemic related reasons is that we're looking at. And one of the key pieces that I thought was really interesting in particular is that, really we're talking right now in 2020, so this is everyone, right? But then all of a sudden employers with 16 or less employees get kind of a break for a period of time, and then they have to come back and do it again. So I think our feeling is, okay, if you're doing it now, like take the steps, because it's gonna be inevitable anyway. And especially if they do some of these extensions like we're talking about and it doesn't sunset, just be prepared, be ready. And if you're already kind of putting things together, I know a lot of our clients have been, I don't know if there's any harm in continuing through next year.
Yeah.
Right.
And how do you give somebody something and then take it away and say, well, the law says for this year I don't have to do it? I'm like, oh, culturally, you're going to create a mess.
You are ultimately. And so we'll kind of walk through just some of those new requirements. And this is really focusing on kind of January 2021 specifically, just so that you're prepared and ready. So Jeannie, if you want to talk through these things.
Yeah, super easy, super quick, super fast. 1 hour for every 30 hours worked. So now part-time employees will be eligible for sick time. Up to 48 hours. So in the notion you're a full-time employee, that would be the maximum amount. And there is a carryover, and everybody's like, well, if you only get 48 hours, how can you carry it over? Well, that is true. That would stop. But if you're a part-time employee, now you're going to you could carry over a balance. The use it or lose it, it defaults to the employer on the termination. There's also a lot of little nuances to if the employee terminates within 6 months and comes back, you have to restore them to their prior balance. So there's a lot of pieces and parts. It's not as cut and dry. Reasons for leaving, very similar to how the Colorado Help is set up right now. Illness, they've expanded it to include domestic abuse, harassment, sexual assault. I should say there's already a law on the books right now to protect those three things. The difference is it's unpaid. Now it'll be paid. This one is very interesting. After 4 days of leave, you can ask for a doctor's note. Historically, most handbook, and I think every handbook I've ever looked at in my entire career says, I can ask you any time for a doctor's note. Yeah, not anymore. You now can only do it on the 4th day. More importantly, I think most handbooks I've seen, 3 days, no call, no show, we are going to automatically terminate your employment. Now, this particular law discusses the termination due to attendance. And I can tell you the way it is written, it's highly suggestive that you not be terminating people due to attendance because of an illness, because I think you're going to lose. They've protected that. And then the last one is, the availability for an employee to care for an employee's family member. Legal considerations. If you already currently offer sick leave that currently offers 48 hours, you don't have to do anything. Just as long as your accrual still matches or is equal to the current law. If you offer a PTO policy, let's say, for example, you offer 80 hours, and perhaps maybe you give it on day one, maybe it's accrual over a period of time, just know mentally or somewhere in your policies, 48 hours is being carved out for sick time. So now technically, while you didn't want to offer more, the employee has pretty much lost at least 6 out of those 10 days because it's now earmarked for sick time only. Now, yes, you can do that, but do you want to be that employer? I don't know. I mean, maybe not. And you have to retain all paid sick leave records, accruals, usage, so on and so forth. Again, that's something you should have already been doing under payroll laws. My personal favorite, posting requirements, violation of $100 per violation. And I actually emailed the CDLE and I said, what does that mean per violation? And they said, well, what do you mean? And I said, well, is that just every time you don't hang the poster? And they said, no, every day that the poster is not hung.
Yeah, well, because that's the 4th day that you're not notifying. Yep. Okay. Well, hopefully that's helpful, at least just to how to think about it. Again, certainly if you're in a certain construct, you might have the ability to kind of follow some of that and not follow some of that. But this is something just to understand, like, what is it that you need to have set up, and may as well just kind of be looking at it now. So we kind of walked through equal pay, equal work. I think, I always enjoy talking with Jeannie. We have great conversations, so it's fun when we can record it and share it with everybody else. So certainly.
No, everybody else thinks that, but we do.
But I think that if you do have questions, we are certainly around. We appreciate your time. We know you have options of the things that you can do rather than spend your day with us here on the webinar at lunchtime. But we do want to say thank you very much. We will send out this recording to you along with the slides as soon as I have it kind of uploaded and everything else. I would encourage you to take a look at our YouTube channel. It's kind of where we house anything that we do that is public in nature. And that is HR Explained. So you're certainly welcome to look there as well. We want to thank you for your time. I think, at least I haven't seen any questions or anything come through. So I think that if you do, you probably know where to reach out to us. Otherwise, we wish you have a wonderful rest of your week. And thank you once again. Jeannie, anything else?
Nope, I enjoyed it as always.
All right. Well, thank you so much. And we hope that you have a great day.